Come gather round chess fans wherever you roam, and admit that the prodigious talent around you has grown, and accept it that soon Magnus Carlsen be dethroned. What I'm trying to say is that the times they be a-changin', and I do believe there will come a day when the videos that I make on the sensational young prodigy Faustino Oro will begin to outperform any and all of my videos on Magnus Carlsen. And that day may be sooner than you think, because this ridiculously talented 12-year-old has just shattered yet another chess record only days ago at a tournament in his home country of Argentina by becoming the youngest player ever to achieve his second Grandmaster norm, with an incredible performance rating of 26.08, putting him only one Grandmaster norm away from becoming the youngest Grandmaster in the history of the game. And I have no doubt that he's going to get there, probably in his very next tournament, since for his age, this kid is outperforming every player in the history of the game, including Magnus Carlsen. He's already scored some unbelievable wins against some of the world's most elite players, the most impressive of which just might be the game we're looking at today, in which the young Faustino takes down the 32nd best player in the world, the 2700 rated Nihal Sarin, in a rapid game from this year's FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championship. After we look at that game, I'm going to very briefly show you the final game from Faustino's most recent tournament where he scored that second GM norm. So make sure to stick around for that. But let's get right into this first game. It is a masterpiece, maybe Faustino's greatest to date. Faustino is in command of the Alabaster Armada, and he kicks off this earth-shattering annihilation with knight to f3. Nihal responds b6, a move that is quite rare, which unfortunately in chess does not make it any more valuable, except maybe when it comes to getting this prodigious young whippersnapper out of his opening prep. Faustino is unfazed though. He plays the top engine move, e4, getting it in while he can, and after bishop to b7 attacking the pawn, knight to c3 defending, e6 and d4, we have bishop to b4, pinning the k to the k, now threatening to take on e4. Bishop to d3 defends, knight to f6 attacks the pawn again, and what do you think white should do here? Queen to e2 looks very natural, defending the pawn, but Faustino's move knight to d2 is actually stronger, as it prepares to meet d5 with e5 and knight to e4 with queen to g4, hitting g7, hitting the knight, and white is much better. What's played in the game is the much more sensible d6, clearing the way for knight b to d7 while discouraging any e5 from white. We have back-to-back kingside castling, and now queen to e2. a3 may have been a bit more accurate, as it would have forced black to part with his dark squared bishop, seeing that bishop to a5 would allow it to be trapped with b4. But after Nihal's strong reply, c5, if a3 is tried now, then black can mix things up a bit if he wants to with c takes d4, counterattacking white's knight, or bishop takes c3, followed by d5, when e5 can be met with c4, trapping white's bishop on d3, as a consequence of this move queen to e2. So Faustino instead captures on c5, Nihal recaptures towards the center, generally a good thing to do. Faustino now correctly concludes that d5 is going to be a good move for black, threatening c4, trapping his bishop, hence the move knight to d1, preparing c3 next, attacking black's bishop while giving his an escape route. Maybe he'll redeploy the knight to e3 at some point. It is an interesting idea, but unsurprisingly, the engine prefers something a bit more forward-moving like e5. This seems playable enough though, and after Nihal's reply, knight b to d7, we do have c3, kicking the bishop back to a5, followed by f4, supporting a possible e5. It's not playable just yet, due to the loose nature of the bishop on d3, but Nihal preempts it anyway with bishop to c7, getting another eye on that square. Faustino responds with a move that you should always play whenever you don't have anything better to do, king to h1, just getting off that ODSD. And if you're wondering, doesn't c4 qualify as something better, taking more control of d5 while reopening the c3 square for the knight on d1? Well, I'm not going to argue with you, and neither is Stockfish. And after a couple of wing pawn pushes and rook to e8 from Nihal, neither is Faustino, as he does now play that move, closing diagonal number 2 for his light squared bishop, which is why you could make the argument that playing bishop to b5 first would have been a bit better, but Faustino likes his bishop right where it is, supporting his center, pointed at black's king side, ready to spring to life if and when e5 is ever played. Nihal responds with the unnecessarily defensive and or somewhat weakening h6, which in his defense can be useful in some lines where white otherwise may have been able to sacrifice his bishop on h7 after kicking the knight out of f6, but since e5 is not yet playable, black definitely had better things to do. And after Faustino returns the favor with a passive move of his own, b3, we now have a very good move, knight to b8, headed to c6 to eye up some beautifully weak dark squares in white's camp. Faustino plays his knight to c3 so that knight to c6 can be met with knight to b5, watching over the d4 square. And we now have an inaccuracy with the move e5. When if Faustino were to play his best move, f takes e5, then d takes e5 could be met with an exchange sack on f6, to which black's best response would be knight to d4, attacking white's queen, seeing that after knight takes knight and the queen recaptures, white's rook on a1 will be hanging. So queen to h5 is best, and after g takes f6 and the rather unexpected knight to f1, activating the dark squared bishop, looking to reroute the knight to g3 where it will be eyeing up some very delectable squares, white is the heavily preferred side, and actually winning according to the engine. What's played instead is the second best move in the position, f5, and this brings us to a good moment to stop and assess. Black's got a weak and backward pawn on d6. He's also got a bad bishop on c7, but then again so does white on d3. There is of course this move knight to d4, now played by Nihal, attacking the queen, when if white were to capture the knight, then after e takes d4, black would have himself a passed pawn, not to mention the opened e-file, with a lot of pressure coming down on e4. So Faustino does not capture the knight, but rather moves his queen to e3. Next we have rook to a6, which besides adding some unnecessary defense to d6, doesn't seem to accomplish a whole lot. Faustino puts his rook on b1, adding some defense to b3, probably so that he can move his knight at some point without losing the pawn. Next we have bishop to b8 from Nihal, getting out of the view of the knight, thereby relieving his queen of her defensive duty. Not sure why that was immediately necessary though, seeing that after Faustino's queen to h3, Nihal doesn't have anything better to do with his queen than to just put it on d7. And here's a challenging question for you. For a whopping 500 points, the most I've ever offered, see if you can figure out what the engine says that Faustino should have played instead of queen to h3. I don't think anybody's going to get this, but if you do, you gotta let us know about it in the comments. Are you ready for this? The best move was apparently rook to b2, which looks very strange and almost random until you realize that it enables knight to b1 followed by knight to c3, which would have been the quickest way to get that knight into the beautiful d5 square while maintaining defense of b3. So not an easy move to spot, but anyway, after Nihal's queen to d7, we now have rook to e1 from Faustino, adding defense to the other weak pawn in his position on e4. And after a blunderous retreating move from Nihal, knight to c6, which I'm not going to even pretend to understand, what do you think Faustino plays next? He plays rook to b2. Now whether or not he's actually considering knight to b1 at this point, or if he's just thinking about some lateral potential for his rook, I couldn't tell you. But after Nihal puts his knight right back on d4, black's now got a losing position, due to the fact that he's wasted two moves that could have been spent on improving his position with something like bishop to c7 followed by bishop to d8. And we're going to see how that could have made a difference in just a few moves. Knight to b1 is still very decent here, but Faustino now realizes, if he didn't before, that knight to f1 is even better, with the idea of going to g3 and then to h5. He's correctly determined that black's kingside is where the fruit is now hanging the lowest. Nihal now plays the move that he should have played 3 moves ago, bishop to c7, headed to d8 to add some essential defense to that side of the board, but sadly he's just a hair too late because Faustino now has a winning sacrifice that I would ask you to try to spot, but it's so obvious that I won't even bother, because we all know it's queen takes h6. I'm only kidding, that's totally losing. What's played is of course bishop takes h6, when after g takes h6 and queen takes h6, Faustino now has the 2 pawns for his sacrificed bishop, while black's king is horribly exposed and facing an imminent rook to e3 followed by rook to g3 check, forcing mate. Something must be done, and what's tried is a move that would save the day if black's bishop were on d8, and that move is d5, setting up the potential for a discovered attack on white's queen, which Faustino should just allow with c takes d5, seeing that something like knight takes d5 could be met with queen to g5 check, a move that wouldn't be possible if black's bishop had made its way to d8, guarding that square. And I of course gotta throw in my standard disclaimer that there's a whole lot more to this variation than we have time to look at here, but suffice to say that in the game, Faustino does not play the correct move c takes d5, but rather the extremely incorrect queen to g5 check, removing defense from f8, where if black were to now move his king, then he would once again have reason to hope, seeing that it could take refuge on e7. But instead we have king to h8, which just looks crazy, but it's not as bad as you might think, since after rook to e3, or the slightly inferior move that's played in the game, c takes d5, black is now able to block the h-file with knight to h7, hitting the white queen. Bishop to d8 was a bit better, though also totally losing, so we won't worry about it too much. If white had played rook to e3 instead of taking the pawn on d5, then he could play rook to h3 here, pinning the knight to the king, forcing black to play f6 to add defense. But here, the white queen must move, so Faustino puts it on h5. Next we have bishop to d8, probably thinking about some bishop to g5, followed by rook to h6, attacking the queen, defended by the bishop. Now the cleanest win for white here is going to be knight takes d4, with the idea of meeting c takes d4 with bishop takes rook on a6, or even the stronger bishop to b5, attacking the queen, followed by bishop takes rook on e8. If black takes with the e-pawn, well, then you got e5, threatening f6, followed by mate on h7, and black's pretty much toast. He's got to play f6, allowing e6, then white can play his bishop takes a6, and it's more or less game over. This wasn't seen in the game, though, where after bishop to d8, we have the severely erroneous knight to e3 from Faustino, allowing Nihal to put himself right back in the game with the move he doesn't find, queen to e7, planning queen to g5, when white will have no way to avoid the trade of queens while also maintaining his winning advantage. What's played is rook to g8, which isn't too bad, as it does give black a fighting chance after Faustino's strong reply, knight to g4, attacking the undefended pawn on e5 while preparing to meet queen to e7 with f6, defended by the knight. Knight takes d4, followed by bishop takes rook on a6 is still on the cards as well. So with that in mind, Nihal decides that the best practical try is going to be to sacrifice the exchange with rook takes g4. And after Faustino recaptures with his queen, he follows up with rook to h6. Getting out of the view of the bishop, getting opposite white's king, while preventing the white queen from hopping back on the h-file to repin his knight to the king. White's best move now, and possibly the only winning one, is going to be rook to e3, planning either rook to g3, threatening to come into g8, or rook to h3, depending on how black responds. But instead, we have the equalizing rook to f1. Not going to lie to you, this move is a bit of a mystery to me. Does Faustino envision a world where he's going to be playing f6? I have no idea. But after knight to f6 hitting his queen and queen to g3, the engine is calling this a dead draw. Black's a bit down on material here, but apparently he's got compensation, having the more active pieces and a king that is now reasonably safe. Nihal continues king to h7, getting his monarch even more cozy, and now we have knight takes d4, to which black should respond with the obvious c takes d4. But Nihal decides to get a little funky now with knight to h5, attacking the white queen first, which I almost don't even want to call a mistake, because the reason is so far from obvious. But if Faustino were to play his best move here, queen to g4, instead of the inferior move that he plays, queen to f3, then after c takes d4, he could get a big advantage with the move b4, looking to open the b-file for his rook, without having to worry about c takes b4, rook takes b4, and queen to e7, hitting the rook while also threatening to come into h4 to potentially target h2. Now, if black had left his knight on f6, then apparently he could effectively counter the move b4 with bishop takes d5, followed by e4, defended by the knight, giving him two very scary-looking connected passers, seeing that white's queen would still be on g3. So I thought I should at least mention that line for the sake of posterity, if nothing else. What's played in this here equal position, though, by the future world champion of chess is g3, just preventing any knight to f4, maybe thinking about a possible h4 to keep black's queen out of g5. Best for black now is going to either be queen to d6, queen to e7, or bishop to e7, and you might already have an idea why. Seeing that after Nihal's losing move, bishop to g5, looking to infiltrate e3, and Faustino's winning reply b4, we see that black has no good way to prevent white from opening the b-file. Taking on a4 with the queen does not win a pawn due to the fact that b takes a5 comes with a discovered attack on the bishop. So we do have a takes b4, and after the rook recaptures, the bishop does come into e3. It is a very nice square, but you know what's even nicer? Rook f to b1, threatening to win the bishop on b7. No way for black to add defense, so it's dropped back to c8. But now, here comes Ingrid the a-pawn, ready to go to a6, defended by the bishop. So, what to do as black? Well, you got to try to get tricky with queen to d8, attacking the pawn while also threatening a sacrifice on g3, followed by bishop to f4, which wasn't a threat on the last move due to the fact that black's queen had no way to join in the fun via this dark square diagonal. Feel free to play around with that line on your own if you'd like. Faustino is very aware of the danger here, so he continues with a very good move. In fact, it's his only winning move, rook to b6, just looking to eliminate black's best good attacker. Nihal says, I think not, with knight to f6, blocking. Faustino could just start pushing his passer here, but he's in no hurry. He plays king to g2, getting his king a tad safer, unpinning his h-pawn. Next we have queen to c7, looking to sneak into c3 and make some mischief and mayhem, maybe even some soap. Faustino says you shall not pass with rook to c6, attacking the queen, as well as the bishop through the queen. If black were to play something like queen to d8, maintaining defense, then one way or another, white's a-pawn would be making its way into the promised land with the help of its hefty support system. Nihal can see that that's going to end poorly, so he makes what is probably the best practical decision. He takes the pawn on a5, giving up his bishop to rook takes c8, seeing that he's now got queen to d2 check, hitting the b on d3. Queen to e2 blocks the check while defending, but now comes the very tricky knight takes e4, when if the bishop were to recapture, then white would of course lose his queen. So we have queen takes d2, when after knight takes d2, hitting the rook, the simplest thing to do would be to play something like rook to b8. White is now the exchange up with an extra pawn, so he's comfortably winning, but Faustino has something much more savage in mind. He plays f6, discovered check, blocking the black rook's defensive d6. More on that in just a moment. Now this is a very bold thing for Faustino to do and requires an incredible level of self-confidence, since after Nihal's reply e4, white's now got two pieces that are simultaneously under attack, while black has two connected passers that are very ominously advancing. Faustino has everything under control though. He plays d6, threatening to create a new queen in just two moves, which black doesn't seem to have any way to prevent. But after Nihal's rook takes f6 and Faustino's pawn pushed to d7, we now have rook to f2 check, when after king to h3, the bishop is able to go to g5, guarding that d8 square, ready to meet the promotion of the pawn with bishop takes d8, followed by the capture of the bishop on d3, probably after bishop takes e4 check, resulting in a roughly equal position. So Faustino does not promote the pawn, he plays rook to b5, just attacking the bishop, at which point the engine is giving white a forced mate in 18 moves at most, if black plays bishop to e7, when after rook to e8, black's bishop is not going to be able to permanently defend against the promotion of the pawn, since white can play rook to b6 in response to bishop to f6, and then king to g4 if the bishop goes to g5. So what's tried is f5, but now comes rook to b7, and with it, the threat of promoting the pawn with check. So the black king really needs to move, and Nihal puts it on g6. We have rook to c6 check, driving the king to h5. And what do you think white should play now? How about rook to b8, threatening checkmate in 3, beginning with rook to h8 check? Nihal answers this with bishop to e7, giving his king the g5 square, but it only delays the inevitable, since after rook to h8 check, king to g5, rook to g8 check, king back to h5, and rook g to g6, white is now threatening mate in 2, beginning with rook to h6 check, against which black has no satisfactory defense. What's tried is the desperado rook takes h2 check, when after king takes h2 and Nihal finally captures the bishop on d3, if white were to now deliver check from h6, the black king could go to g4, seeing that that square is no longer defended by the white king. So what does Faustino do? He just puts his king right back on h3, leaving Nihal with no good way to stop the incoming mate. Hence his decision in this position to resign the game. The best way for black to prolong his misery would be with bishop to f8, guarding that h6 square. This of course removes defense from d8, giving white a very pretty little mate in 4 with rook to g5 check, king to g5, d8 with promotion, and check, bishop to e7, queen takes e7 check, king to h5, and finally queen to h4 check mate. So what a game! How on earth is any 12-year-old human mind capable of producing chess of this caliber? As tempted as I am to start throwing around words like non-human and sorcery, I won't do it just yet. I'll at least wait till he's over 18. He'll probably be the world's #1 player by that time. But anyway, moving right along to our game number 2. This one was played on December 16th in the final round of the Magistral Smetan Ghiardelli tournament in Buenos Aires, where Faustino made history by achieving his second Grandmaster norm. This time he's got the black pieces. He's up against a 25-67 rated Grandmaster by the name of Diego Flores. Now I'm going to go ahead and breeze through about the first 30 moves of this game without any commentary, because most of it really isn't all that interesting. As you can see, the queens come off the board relatively early. At one point, white is a bit better according to the engine, probably due in part to his spatial advantage. But by the time we get to this position, it's not really obvious how he's going to make any progress. And there's a good reason for that, which is that the position is pretty much equal. But Diego, apparently not willing to accept that, now decides to get a little adventurous by sacking the exchange with rook takes b4. When after Faustino's recapture, rook to b2 and rook to a7, white is able to now grab the pawn on b4, giving him this 3-on-1 pawn majority, which the engine says is ample compensation for his slight material deficit. So still a roughly equal position after king to e7, bishop to f3, f6, and knight to e4, but after Faustino's bishop to d7, Diego now misses his only move that maintains equality. Give the video a good long pause if you'd like to try to guess what that move is. What needs to be played is an immediate c5. You got to get that pawn majority moving while you can. The point is, after b takes c5, you can put the rook on c4, preparing to recapture on c5 when it's most convenient with either knight or rook, depending on how black proceeds. If he tries rook to c7 defending, well then there's b6 attacking the rook, followed by a5. That's not going to end well. Those connected passers really need to stay where they are. Rook to a8, targeting a4 would just run into a discovered attack with knight takes c5. That's also losing. The engine's recommending e5, f takes e5, f takes e5, and rook takes c5 with a dead equal position, since black can now either grab the pawn on a4, allowing rook takes e5 with check, or he can capture on c5 when after knight takes c5, the pawn on a4 is defended. But let's contrast this with what's played in the game, which after Faustino's bishop to d7 is the totally losing bishop to d1. Okay, looks kind of sensible. He's adding some defense to the pawn on a4, probably thinking about that line we just looked at where black had the option of capturing that pawn with his rook. But here, Faustino's e5 is now a winning move. However, after Diego plays f takes e5, despite having totally outplayed his grandmasterly opponent, Faustino Oro now agrees to a draw. Why would he do this? Well, it's simple. It's the final round of the tournament, and he knows that a draw will guarantee him that second grandmaster norm. So I can't say that I blame him for not wanting to take any unnecessary risk. He wants to be the youngest GM in history, and I think he's going to get there. But let's have a look at how the game could have continued after f takes e5 when black's bishop is now very active. It can go to f5 looking to take out the knight on e4, which would give black a passed pawn, or just apply pressure to d3 if the knight moves, maybe push a pawn to e4 at some point, creating a passed pawn that way. White's bishop is in a pretty sad way, tied down to defending against rook to a8, followed by rook takes a4. So in summary, white just doesn't have nearly enough going for him here to justify his material deficit. The engine is giving over 2.5 pawns in black's favor, by the way, if you can believe that. But that's it for now. If you enjoyed the video and or think that Faustino Oro is any good at chess, then go ahead and hit that like button, leave a comment with anything that's on your mind, and last but not least, do consider subscribing to the channel to see more content like this delivered to you on a regular basis, and I will see you next time.